Hey, good morning, everybody in political science and U.S. government. I haven't put up a video for a little bit. I was of the opinion that most students don't really like these videos or don't look at them very much. But a couple of students reached out and said, "Hey, I miss it. You seem like you're a little bit behind over it. It's okay. I'd like to see the videos come up again." So, back by popular demand, I'll try to catch up and put more videos up. I just didn't think they were that useful for you guys as students. I think the book is pretty good, and the materials that are related there in terms of the exercises we do are sufficient. But I like doing these videos. I just didn't think you guys cared for them too much, and like you guys too, I got really busy and put it on the back burner. But I was surprised at the request, and I'm happy to do it. So let's put up chapter 7 from our textbook, and this is about voter registration, voter participation, and elections. I just want to start off with the good news. This most recent election, the presidential election of 2020, has probably surpassed, I think, everyone's expectation in terms of voter turnout. Now, some people might argue, well, a lot of it's fraud or it's fake or it's not. There's very little evidence of that. It looks like the people that voted were eligible to vote, and they came out in very, very high numbers, percentage wise, not just in terms of the actual numbers of people voted, and because we have more people in the population eligible to vote than we ever have. So that has to be taken in context. But still, the percentage is very, very high voter turnout. And that's what we want if we want a healthy democracy. We want people to participate in it. I still think, and it's still relevant, that historically, in certainly the 20th century and 21st century, we've had very poor voter turnout, not only in the national elections, but even more so on the local and state election level. It's really palpable. And I'll talk a little bit about my little campaign that I had in 1997. I won a selectman seat in the town of Sturbridge, Mass. And I can remember the newspaper the next day said strong voter turnout approaching 30%, not 30% of the population. 30% of the eligible voters came out, and that was considered a good return, a good outcome in local town elections. And to me, that's shockingly just, I think it's disgusting. Although I won, so I was happy. But democracy, if it really needs to play out, we all need to participate. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon. Most civic groups, most educational institutions, most people who are involved in civic activity are always promoting voting. But you have to be careful. Think about it. Are those who are participating in voting already aligned to my kind of outlook and goals in terms of what I think public servants should be working on and focusing on? Would different people who have historically not participated in the voting process maybe undermine that or derail that direction? So we all want participation, but be careful what you ask for, because sometimes the results might be quite shocking. Because if you get people participating that might be voting in candidates that you don't like, you're like, geez, why was I asking for that? But I do believe it represents a healthy representation of what the people want, and that's what a democracy is, not a direct democracy. Remember that for the final exam, certainly, and other material. The framers of our Constitution, I think most people still to this day, are leery of pure popular decision making. We want it to be filtered through representatives in a Republican form of democracy, and we want it also filtered by other mechanisms that basically put a checks and balances in our system of governance to ensure that those who are in the minority, and I don't mean racial minority or ethnicity or religion, I'm talking about minority in terms of being in the unpopular position stance, still have rights that are protected, preserved, and allowed to be basically exercised and promoted in our society. Very dangerous to have a pure democracy. So, anyways, who's eligible to vote? We know that over time, the government has promoted, both state, certainly state of Massachusetts, but even federally, has promoted more voter participation and has eased the ability for us to register to vote so we can participate. Some states have a history of putting a chilling effect on that, especially for African Americans and minorities. We know that in some southern states, they put up many barriers to make it very difficult for African Americans to participate. There was a small period during Reconstruction where they were very active and allowed to vote. That's because the federal government, basically controlled by the northern interest, were occupying the South with military forces in a group called the Freedmen's Bureau, and they made sure that African Americans had the ability to participate in civic life. But we know Reconstruction ended in 1877, and Jim Crow laws and poll taxes and literacy tests, all these other very difficult measures that were only really applied to African Americans came into place to put a chilling effect on their vote. What changed all that? The Civil Rights Act of 1964. A lot of people give credit to John F. Kennedy for it. It was brewing during his administration, but we know he was assassinated in '63. But Lyndon Johnson pushed it through with the Congress, and the Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, had a huge impact on the federal government, basically getting involved in those states that had a history of putting a chilling effect on voters' rights and participation. But that was recently gutted, and this will be on the exam. I know maybe that's why some of you like these videos, because I do allude to things that will be on the exam. It's the Holder case. Eric Holder was the Attorney General at the time, and he was sued in the case of Shelby County, I believe Alabama or Mississippi, one of the two southern states, sued Holder in 2013 saying southern states are the only states that have to have this federal oversight and approval of our electoral processes, and there's no need for it. It's violation of the equal protection of the law and the Comity Clause of the Constitution, saying the northern states don't have this oversight and this burden to bear. Why should we have it when there's no evidence of any need for it? And the fact was, or they could prove to the Supreme Court of the United States in that case, that in the southern states, there's actually greater enrollment and participation of African Americans in the electoral process than in some of the northern or western states that don't have to participate in the legislation from the 1964 Civil Rights and Voter Rights Act. And so the Supreme Court shot it down. A lot of people say, well, what the Supreme Court shot down was the very measure of why African Americans were participating so actively in the democratic process in the southern states. When you remove it, they're going to go back to basically making it difficult for people potentially. But the Supreme Court left that open. Like if it changes and there's evidence of discrimination and unfair practices, you can bring in the federal government again to basically oversee elections, but you have to be able to prove there's a problem. If there's no problem, they shouldn't have to jump over that higher hurdle. But who can basically participate? We know because of, and I should have it memorized, but it's one of the constitutional amendments, I believe it was passed in 1973, that the federal government, for any federal election that's 18 years or older, male or female, there's no bar for race or anything else, but you do have to be a citizen of the United States of America, and usually citizenship for your state. Most have a 30-day rule, some have a little bit longer, some have a shorter rule. Just so this is my intent, I moved to Massachusetts today, I want to be in Massachusetts, you can register to vote. So that's very liberalized. It's pretty easy to register to vote. I know I just changed my voter identification maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago from one party to another. I do that quite often. If I ever run for office and somebody wants to make fun of me or challenge me, they say, who are you? What's your identity? Because you change political parties so often. And I do, because I'm trying to help a certain candidate sometimes in a primary. And we'll get to that in a second. Primary voting is only within the party. And so if you want to vote for someone in the Democratic Party during a primary, you have to be a Democrat. And same, if you want to vote for somebody in the Republican primary, you have to be a Republican. And then sometimes I get so disgusted by party politics, I unenroll and become a independent, which is the great majority in Massachusetts, technically, even though we have mostly Democratic elected state officials, other than the governor. Most people identify as unenrolled. I'll get to that in a second. So anybody basically 18 or over, there's no barrier, race, color, creed, national origin. You just have to be a citizen of the United States and also a resident of the state you're in. And again, residency rules vary from state to state, but most of them are about 30 days, and then you can establish residency, and then you're eligible to register to vote. And it shouldn't be a very burdensome process. In fact, most states have made it very liberal. You usually can do it. I did mine on the internet recently, registered to change party, but you can do the registry to vote right on there. You can register to vote, I believe, when you get your license either renewed or your very first time you get your license. A lot of different mechanisms for getting registered. It's not that difficult a process. But whenever there's a process, let's face it, it puts a chilling effect. If you got to go do something in order to exercise really a right and a privilege, some of us say, I just don't have the time. My son downstairs, the room below me right now, he's 20 years old, bright kid. He never got around to registering to vote. He actually held political science for me at a primary not that long ago. And I said, "Did you get a chance to go in and vote yet?" And he goes, "I don't think I'm registered yet." I said, "What do you mean you don't think you're ready?" "You know." I don't remember doing it. I said, "Well, just go in and check. They'll pull your name up and see if you can vote." And they did, and he wasn't registered, so he couldn't vote. And then it was too late for him to vote in the general election, which is bothersome to me because I'm so involved in civic life. But let's face it, a lot of people just don't feel that the vote counts or matters. But the good news is on this most recent election in 2020, on the national election, there was a huge voter turnout, and I think that's very healthy. Now, the big debate, and some people want to talk about it, should people who are convicted of certain felonies still be eligible to vote? Should people who are actually doing incarcerated time at this moment be able to vote? And we don't have a universal rule throughout the country because most voter eligibility rules are state derived. That's that federalist system with it. It makes it very complicated. You might be voting in a federal election, but to determine whether you're eligible to vote in the state of Virginia or Florida or Massachusetts might all be very different based upon things like having a criminal conviction um, or the rest. I'm a big believer in that once you've completed your punishment, you should be able to return to civic life because we expect people to hopefully be rehabilitated to go out and be part of the workforce, to have homes, to be a citizen, to obey. And part of obeying is having an acknowledgement that what you're obeying is part of the democratic system from the people, and you are part of the people. I'm a little bit more torn on the argument that while you're doing time, should you be able to cast an absentee ballot? There's arguments both ways, and I haven't given it a lot of thought. But it does seem like there's an argument that, well, while you're serving time and being punished, you give up obviously your liberty, which is the most fundamental right of a free society, but maybe you give up other fundamental rights like the eligibility to vote. Imagine if it was clear class, so I could just imagine myself at Walpole, which is now called Cedar Junction, up there campaigning. I wonder if the active participant voting, absentee voting would be up there. But it's interesting. But I do think people who are done with their incarcerated status, I don't see why they shouldn't. Other states disagree with that. In some states, I think it was Florida for a period of time, if you had pending fines on criminal matters that were yet unpaid, you lost your eligibility to vote. And I think it was Mike Bloomberg from New York, who anti-Trump guy, he paid off a lot of those fines specifically to allow those people to become eligible to vote again. It looks like Trump won Florida, so it didn't really have a different outcome in that. But there's debates on who should be eligible. Some people think people who are recent immigrants but not yet citizens should vote. And that's something that's being debated to this day. But right now, general rule, you're 18 years or older, you can vote. There's no requirement of any kind of religious affiliation, no requirement of any kind of property ownership. My 20-year-old kid who lives across town, I'm going to go see him this afternoon. He and I have the same power in light of the differences in our education and things like that. He's equal to me in the power of voting. And that some people, even the framers, were troubled by that. They wanted the more aristocratic, egalitarian, older property interest people to participate in choosing the governance above us. What do we have now? We are very democratic. We're much more like Jefferson wanted. Pretty much everybody gets to participate that's a citizen of the United States that's over the age of 18. And some people have already advocated we should have it at 15 and have it at 16. I don't feel so comfortable with that. So who's allowed to register? Very easy process. Voter turnout, we know that's much, much higher this year. And I think that's good news. We do want people to participate. Every vote counts. Every vote should be heard, right? What factors drive voter turnout? I've made every single presidential election since I was eligible to vote. I made everyone prior to that too. I wasn't voting, but I'd always go with my dad. Very much engaged. I probably have missed a few, and I know not presidential, but like local ones. Town elections sometimes don't go on the same cycle as the federal or even the state general elections and primaries. So occasionally I miss one. Why? Maybe because the things that are important to me aren't really on the ballot, or the candidate that I like or don't like are unopposed, or it's not in their cycle to run. I'm a little embarrassed by that because I'm so active in it that when I do miss an election, I always feel a bit terrible about it. But I'm probably batting over 90%, even on the local elections. I think it's important to come out. And they show some of the trends here, and they talked about young people. Young people this time came out and voted, it looks like, based upon the statistics. By the way, we have secret voting in the United States. No one knows who you voted for, but we can tell who you are that you actually went and voted, and we can tell your age and the community you live in, whether you're a male or a female. We don't know your religious affiliation, but it looks like we've often thought young people could really carry the day because they're the most in the population eligible to vote. But historically, they haven't done nearly as much as they could. My favorite discussion on it is George McGovern running against Richard Nixon. George McGovern in 1972 was really running a campaign to end the Vietnam War, and the young people were very much opposed to the Vietnam War. And if young people came out and voted, he should have won in a landslide. He got creamed by Richard Nixon. He got walloped. The young people came out slightly more than in the past elections, but not in big numbers. And George McGovern only won one state of Massachusetts. And that's why after Richard Nixon became vilified, there was a bumper sticker that you could find here in Massachusetts say, "Don't blame us. Don't blame me. I'm from Massachusetts." And that was a reference to Richard Nixon versus George McGovern. Where they did come out in a noticeably higher amount was President Barack Obama's first election. In 2008, they came out in pretty solid numbers. They came out less so in 2012. I don't know, it's because they thought he was going to get reelected or some of the enthusiasm died down. He still won reelection against Mitt Romney. He was running against McCain before that, but the youthful vote did not turn out in nearly as big as numbers in the 2012 election as they did in 2008. Now, where did they come out? They came out in this past election. They really did vote. The millennials, I think they're called millennials. I never got that whole X generation. I got baby boomers, understood that, but I didn't get all the rest of the titles and names, and I don't know who gives them out, by the way. But young people did come out in pretty big numbers in this last election, which is a good thing. Old people have always come out in big numbers. Some people say, old people live for it. They live for going to supper at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with coupons, and they also, before COVID, and they also live to vote. That's an old saying my father used to have. And there's some truth to the voting thing. They're very, very active in voting, and I applaud them for that. I'm getting in there for myself. So, campaign finance laws. This is a mixed area, and a lot of people are confused. They think that the famous case of Citizens United is the name of the case. It's a case where there was a political corporation was basically funding an ad against Hillary Clinton. It went to the Supreme Court saying they were banned to do that. And the Supreme Court said, no, corporations have free speech rights and they can spend their money any way they want because spending money and influencing people is a form of speech. Very controversial case. And so it basically opened up the ability of corporations and private PAC, these are political action committees that raise a lot of money. They can spend money in promoting a philosophy and promoting a candidate indirectly. I mean, they can't work with the candidate. Jim Corman, can't work with this political PAC and say, yeah, can you put up so many signs and so many billboards for me or something like that? Can't work in cohesion with them, but can they go out and promote my interest or condemn the other candidate with publicity and spend a ton of money on it? Yeah, and it's unlimited. But how much we as individuals can donate to these PAC groups or donate to a candidate, those are still legally limited under federal and state laws. And I don't always know the rules on it. I think an individual, it's in the book. Yeah, it's $2,700 per election, $5,000 per year because there's a primary and there's a general. And then you give so much to your state party, Democratic Party, Republican Party, Green Party, whatever the party is. And then there's a national party. You can donate up to $33,000. But all these different individuals can also donate money to PACs. The good news is most of this money has to be transparent in that the government it's been ruled as constitutional that you still have to do reporting. And I think that's a healthy thing. We should be able to know where, hey, Corman's getting a ton of support from the oil industry. Why? I think that helps put pressure on me not to seem to favor the oil industry later on if they've spent a lot of money on my behalf. And I think transparency is very important. And money talks, and this is going to go into the later chapter. I think it's the next chapters on media. It's not, it should be. Elections. Yeah, the media. Let's face it. If no one knows who the heck you are and what your message is and your likability or dislikability, you're not going to go anywhere. And how do you get your name out there? Is the press going to? Sometimes the press does go out and say this person took out papers. Let's do an interview with him. We'll do a little story on him or her, and you get a little bit of press that way. But for the most part, you've got to be able to get money. And I remember my son when it was my daughter then when I first ran for office. She goes, why do you need money? Just go out and run. Knock on the door and ask people to vote for you. Well, I need signs later on, so maybe their neighbors see that they're supporting Jim Corman or things of that nature. Maybe I need to put a little radio ad out there. Maybe I want to put a couple articles in the newspaper with my, slogan or whatever. Maybe I want to get little printed flyers that I can mail to people because it's hard to go door to door and knock on the doors and talk to people. Sometimes it's intrusive. I want to be able to hire, maybe a marketing firm to do robocall. Although I don't think robocalls do a lot personally, but you get the idea. It takes money. It really does. I'm terrible at raising money. I'll tell you, I know a lot of candidates hate it. Some people are very good at glad handling, asking for money. I'm horrified by it, but I just moved to this house right in the middle of COVID in last March, and I was going through all my things, and this popped out of a, uh, I don't know, one of my bags of forms and stuff. But this is when I was a candidate for selectman in Sturbridge. March 28th, we had a fundraiser. I think election was about 2 weeks later, cutting it close. Turned out to be Good Friday, by the way. Those of you that are religious or Christian faith, certainly Catholic faith, Good Friday tends to be a bit of a solemn night, and a lot of people can't go out. But there's also a lot of them don't eat meat on that night. And we had all this doing roasts, and we had to change everything at the last minute. We realized what a really poorly planned event it was. So we actually made chowder, and we had seafood sandwiches, and we had all kinds of other things that were non-meat based. But it was fun because I hated doing it, and it was $10 I had. We actually had a pretty full house, but we spent so much money on food. We had a DJ, and we had cash bar, and although they pay for their own drinks, obviously, but we had to hire a bartender, and we had to rent the hall. And at the end, my buddy, his picture is somewhere behind me there, and you can see a little hint of it. He's sitting there, standing there, a little back, and he passed away, but he was my mentor. He would go and do the math at the end of the night, and we were there about 4 o'clock in the morning after it was all said and done, and we actually broke even. We didn't make any money at all to buy signs or do any of that other advertising we do. It's very, very difficult. But think about it. And this is what John McCain and Feingold, and that's the law that got overturned by the Supreme Court. Senator John McCain, you probably remember him. He passed away not that long ago. And Russ Feinstein, who was, I believe, from Wisconsin. He's no longer in the Senate. But these two guys, one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, one, conservative liberal. They got together and said, this is wrong that finances, money, can influence politics. It should be curtailed in some fashion. And I thought John McCain said it best. He goes, you're telling me that if somebody who donated tens of thousands of dollars to my campaign or was responsible for getting people and organizations to donate a lot of money calls me and I'm in the middle of something, I'm not going to find a way to get off of what I'm doing to speak to that person because they gave so much money to my campaign as opposed to the person that's never given any money or has no ability to give me money. And McCain said it best. Come on, let's be honest. If somebody's done a lot for you financially to help you get into office, you feel like you kind of owe them at least your ear. I think that's truthful, and that bothers me about. And there's movements out there to maybe amend the Constitution to get around that famous case of Citizens United to curtail businesses and organizations, unions and corporations from having this unlimited ability to spend money on behalf of political campaigns, because I think politicians feel they're owed to them. In fact, we couldn't raise much money, and so we had to make homemade signs when I ran for selectman. I was a bit heavier then, and my friend, being a wise guy, this is a picture of one of the billboards he actually painted, and it was hung out in Sturbridge. There was about 8 of them. They were 4x4 pieces of plywood, and he hung them up, and it's Corman. It might be inverted in your camera. 304 pounds of selectmen, and that I actually got a lot of media about because they called me and said, "What's up with these signs about Corman 304 pounds of selectmen?" It's actually a lot heavier than that, but it was my friend did it when I didn't know, and I didn't give consent to put them out. But probably helped me win the election. I won by 6 votes, and I think it was because of that humorous sign, or there were several of those signs at the time. There's only one that survives to this day. But it's an exciting process, being an election process, but it's difficult if you don't have money. And there's a lot of concern that money really buys the election. And I think there's some truth to that. If you're not a famous person, a former football player, baseball player, actress, and you don't get into politics and you're just some person and you have no money, if you're not going to be working through the political party machine, which comes up in a later chapter, I don't know how you raise money. And if you can't raise money, how do you get your voice heard? How do you get people to follow you? It's very, very challenging. And occasionally we have these stories where basically these dark horse candidates do come out of nowhere and do well. That's the exception. It's not the rule. Usually people who are established with the ability to raise money and get media attention win. That segues into the next chapter. So the general election, then we have primaries. You should know about the primary season versus the test material there. In the primary season, this is the recognition that we have a party system in the United States. And in the primary system, there's 2 major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. In the primary, it's usually a closed primary. What does a closed primary mean? Means that only if you're affiliated with that party can you vote in it. Massachusetts has a mixed one, meaning if you're an independent, you can come in and vote. But when you come in to vote, you have to either pick up a Republican voter list or a Democratic one. And that gives, I think, more power to independents to basically switch into whichever primary they want. So it's semi-closed in the sense that we don't want Republicans voting in the Democratic Party, and we want Democrats voting in the Republican Party primaries. Closed primaries versus open primaries. Open primaries doesn't matter what party you're affiliated with. You're just on the ballot and you can vote for anybody, whether you're a Republican or Democrat. You can go in and vote for any of the candidates on the slate. That's called an open primary. You should know the difference. Massachusetts is a semi-closed one. Only Democrats are allowed to vote for Democrats. Only Republicans are allowed to vote for Republicans in the primary. However, independents are allowed to pick up, because the predominant party in Massachusetts are independents, are allowed to pick up either ballot. In the old days, when they picked up a ballot, they become registered in that party upon voting in it. We found that to be ridiculous because people say, it's just one time. I really like this Republican this one time. I really like this Democrat this time. I don't want to leave here being a Democrat or Republican. I want to keep my independent status. And people used to have to unchange that afterwards, which is a bit burdensome. Not anymore. And then the convention seasons. I'll tell you a quick story. I know you guys don't want to hear too many of my stories that are off the cuff, but the conventions are basically that. The parties are just that. You belong to this club of like-minded people, and you want to promote candidates that support your, for the most part, support your philosophical and political views. And they have a big convention to whip up excitement and get organized and get teams out there so they can go out and campaign. And I went to the state Democratic one many years ago, and I collect political memorabilia, and I'm kind of into John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. I have sort of a nostalgic view of their history. And at the time, Joe Kennedy, the older, not the younger, that just lost the Senate campaign, his father was considering running for governor at the time, and he was on the nomination list. And there was parties afterwards, all these big political campaigns with money would throw these parties, and they'd invite all the delegates. And I was a delegate back with my best friend, and we went to the different parties that night, and one of them was Joe Kennedy's party. And I went in there, and they have a lot of alcohol and food, and it's a lot of fun. And I was having a good time, perhaps too good a time. But I was in my best suit, my Brooks Brothers suit, and I didn't know it. But when you went into the party, they would make a big placard for you to wear. Jim Corman, Selectman, Town of Sturbridge, whatever. And I'm in there, and I'm having a good time, and I'm feeling pretty good. And in walks Joe Kennedy, and it was like he's across the side of the room, and he's got other Kennedy members with him, and it was like as if to see part of all the people. And he and I are making eye contact, and he literally from 20 feet away goes, Jim Corman from Sturbridge. And I've met him before a couple of times, so I'm thinking like he really remembers me. He comes running up to me and gives me, Jimmy, it's so nice to see you out there. You gonna help me in Sturbridge? I say, you bet, Mr. Kennedy, you bet. I kept calling him governor. He wasn't governor yet. And he didn't end up running anyways. He goes, hey, let me buy a beer. So next thing I got 2 beers in my hand, and I'm all like, got stars in my eyes. And he goes, hey, and I said, hey, Governor, you got to go talk to some other people. I really appreciate you stopping by and saying hello to me like I'm a big shot. And so he leaves. So we'll talk to you later, Jimmy. I said, great. So my buddy's laughing. He's going, hey, he remembers me. I met him at those other events. One time he was in Sturbridge, and another time at something else. And he goes, he doesn't know you from Adam. He goes, you got a big giant placard on with your name on it with Sturbridge Selectman. You got all the information right in front of him. So he just reads off of it and makes it sound like you're his best buddy. I was crestfallen after that. But I still had a wonderful time. But that's what the conventions are for, is to get the party loyal, if you will, revved up for the election and to pick their candidates. And usually at the convention, it's finalized it doesn't mean they can't be on the ballot. It just means they're endorsed by the party. And I'll give you a perfect example. Glavin is our Secretary of State in Massachusetts, an elected office. He ran as a Democrat. However, the delegates wanted somebody else. They wanted a guy named Zakin was his name, young guy. He ran as a Democrat, but so did Galvin. At the convention, you actually vote at this convention. They endorsed, I can't think of the name again now. Zakim. They endorsed Zakim. They didn't endorse Galvin because, I don't know, party loyal didn't like Galvin. Galvin still ran in the general election as a Democrat, and he beat Zanakis. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. And you have to get so many percentage of the delegates to support you, or you're not allowed to run. You agree as being a Democrat or Republican. If you don't get a certain percentage of the delegate vote at the convention, you agree to basically pack your bags and support the other candidates that are on the ticket. And fundraising, already talked about that. And then the primary, you tend to, if you're a Democrat, you tend to be very liberal in the primary because that's what the red meat issues are. In the general election, you have to be what? You have to be more centrist. You have to become more conservative because you want to get some of the conservative votes on there. Same with Republicans. The Republicans in the primary tend to have to be much more conservative in order to move on to the general. And at the general election, they have to appear more moderate or liberal in order to become a candidate that satisfies the broadest base, because most Americans are where? Kind of in the middle, but the primary requires you to be kind of on the outskirts. And that's one of the arguments why we have more polarization in society, is because of this primary system. Moderates tend not to go very far in either party in the primary. You do well in the general, though. So I'm just looking at some of the voter decision making, some of the advertising. That's really interesting stuff. I like this stuff. Incumbency advantage, you should know about that. We very rarely, although we have this attitude, we got to throw the bums out. We need new people in there. We need fresh blood. We rarely throw out incumbents. There's a huge advantage of being an incumbent once you get in office, as long as you're not doing anything too radical or too, you're not robbing banks or, having I guess affairs aren't a big deal anymore. But at one time it was. If you get caught having an affair or something like that, your political career would be over. But other than that, the power of incumbency, because you have the media highlights. If you're going to go do a press conference, the press is going to cover it because you are the congressperson, you are the state rep, you are the select board member. It brings a lot of power to a re-election because you odds-on favorite, you're going to win. So incumbency is a very powerful tool. Policy making through direct democracy. And the book does talk about the dangers of direct democracy. I did want to talk quickly about the Electoral College. What is it? The framers didn't want direct democracy. They wanted to put this buffer in there. And so each state has a number of electors, and they go to this thing called the college. Just think, they go to the convention, the Electors convention. How many electors do you have? Well, how many Congress members do you have and senators? Well, each state has 2 senators, and every state has at least 1 congressperson. I think we have 13 members of the House and 2 senators. So we have 15 electoral colleges. We might have lost one in the last term, so I could be off. It might be 14. That's how many electors you have. Now, people say, well, the electors can change their mind. And they Massachusetts was won by Biden. Can't one of the electors, because they really love Trump, switch? Well, who are the electors? They're picked by the party that won the state. So if the state won Biden, Democrat, the Democrats pick the most loyal team players from their party to support them. In fact, there's very few times in history where the elector tried to change their vote. It happened recently when Trump beat Hillary Clinton. A few of the electors, they're called disloyal. They're called disloyal electors. That's the actual title for them. I think that's the title they give them. I always thought that was a funny title. But it's very rare to see an elector try to change. They're pretty much locked in. Faithless. They're faithless electors. Even a more strong term. One was done at Al Gore, but it wasn't because they were anti-Al Gore in the election against George W. Bush. He was just protesting the fact that Washington, D.C. Didn't have a senator or something like that. It didn't have equal representation. So to protest, he cast a no-name ballot, and it hurt Al Gore because it was a very close election between him and George Bush. But for the most part, because the parties pick who's going to be the electors, they're going to go the way in which the winners won. They're part of the winning team. It's unheard of. A lot of people want to change the Electoral College because it's a mystery to some people how it works and why we have it. And what it also does, it lessens the influence of large populated states, and it strengthens and emboldens some of the smaller states in our union, because we didn't want to have direct democracy. Otherwise, the coastal areas of back then it was just the East Coast, but eventually became the East Coast and West Coast. Otherwise, the great populations of the East Coast would really determine who the president was, because if it's one person, one vote, the large metropolitan areas really would control the outcome of the race. And they wanted to put a buffer on that called the Electoral College. People who have won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College haven't really fought to change it. Al Gore was one of them. The other one was Hillary Clinton. They both won the popular vote, but they didn't win the Electoral College. Neither of them pushed to change it. They thought it was a structure that serves a purpose. I think most people find it a bit confusing. I think it's unpopular. And I think the concept of one vote, one person is very democratic, and most of us believe in a pure form of democracy that our framers did. But that's just a thought on the Electoral College. Technology, voting decision making. kind of dry stuff. Oh, and this last election, it's not over yet. So I'm going to have to make a new video next year when I teach this class because I'll look dated. Joe Biden right now has the popular vote well in hand. He's definitely going to win the popular vote. And it looks like he's going to win the Electoral College vote right now. The states that are undecided are all leaning towards his favor. And right now we only need 6 more of the Electoral College vote. He'll have won both. And certainly the popular vote without question. Well, I shouldn't say without question because some people are going to say there's fraud. And that brings up another issue. Might as well talk about registration. When I go in to vote, do they ask me for an ID in Massachusetts? No, they don't. In fact, when I was living at my other house, previous house, I should say, in Sturbridge, my son and daughter were registered there, and so was I. So when I'd go there, I'd give my address, and they look up and say, Jack? And I'd say, no, Jack's my son. I'm James. And they would check me out if I go vote. Now, what would prevent me from coming back in like 2 hours later and saying, hi, give the address, and then say, oh, you must be Jack, and then just say, yeah. Would that be voter fraud? You bet it would. It's true, in my estimation, that if people really wanted to identify themselves as somebody else, knowing they would be unlikely to turn up the vote, it probably can be done. But there's evidence that it's very rarely done, not enough to influence elections, at least in modern era. When I say modern era, there's an argument back in John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon that John F. Kennedy's father had some kind of influence with fake or fraudulent voting in the Chicago region of Illinois. I don't know if that's true. It's a lot of these things speculation, it's folklore, but the groups that do oversight into election integrity suggest that voter fraud is very de minimis, and it often gets ferreted out and caught. There's actually a New Hampshire couple that got caught. They voted both in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So it was easy to get caught. They kept their same name and identity, and they were seen in the voter registration from 2 different states for the same election. They got caught. They're facing. They're elderly. They apparently really like the candidate very much, but I doubt they'll do jail time. But it's taken pretty seriously. Yeah, ballot fatigue. Closed primary, we talked about that. Delegates, I've been a delegate in the state. I've never been a delegate to the federal election. If you ever watched one, there's a great one where Bobby Kennedy speaks right after his brother was assassinated. It's probably one of the most moving things I've ever watched. We should talk about recall and referendum. There's a thing in democracy that sometimes our reps aren't doing what we want, so we can recall them. It's a very powerful tool. It's rarely used. It's used a fair amount on local levels. Somebody's they're just not showing up doing their job or what they're doing, and we think they're crazy. We can recall them prior to the expiration of the election. Rarely done, but it's an important safety valve in our democracy, even more democratizing our system. That's usually on the local level. The other one is the ballot and the referendum and the referendum and the initiative. This is when our government's just not taking up the cause on the state level, so we put it up to referendum or initiative. One of them is only recommending. The people of Massachusetts hereby recommend that the legislature take up this following legislation. The initiative is just that. You vote on it, it becomes a law. We had 2 of them on the most recent ballot. One was the right to repair bill about private repair companies having access to the computer data in your motor vehicle, because right now they don't under some strange law. That was the legislature never took it up, so the people took it up, and it went to initiative, and it passed. The second one that people were trying to push in our state was something called ranked choice voting, a very complex system where we don't always know who we'd want for second place or third place, and we want to so if there's 5 candidates, you should be able to rank them. This is my first choice, my second choice, all the way through, and maybe it would help on multi-seat commissions and boards and things. That got shot down in a big number, but it was on the ballot. We got at least to make a decision as the people and that's direct democracy when you hear about referendum and initiative. And a little controversial because I'm not so sure I want the people to directly do it. I want my hopefully thoughtful representatives who have worked on it and vetted it out and had hearings on these things, done those kinds of things. Book's pretty solid on it. Kept you too long, but I wanted to put up another video. And thanks again for asking for them.